My name is Michael Turner, and for a few quiet years, I lived alone on a narrow road just outside a small town in northern Pennsylvania. It wasn't the kind of place most people passed through unless they already had a reason to be there. The road curved slowly through old trees and shallow hills, with only a few houses spaced far apart from each other. At night, especially during the fall and winter months, the only sound you usually heard was the wind moving through the branches or rain tapping gently across the roofs. I didn't mind that kind of silence. Actually, I had always preferred it. The house I lived in had belonged to my grandfather before me. He had moved there sometime in the late 70s, long before the road had even been paved. When I was younger, I used to visit him during summers and sometimes around Thanksgiving. I remembered sitting with him on the front steps while he drank coffee slowly and watched the trees across the road as if he were listening for something only he could hear. After he passed away, the house stayed empty for a few years before I finally decided to move there myself. At the time, I needed a quieter place to live, and the house already felt familiar to me. Across the road from my grandfather's place stood another house. It was older than ours, though not by much, and it sat slightly farther back from the road, behind a crooked wooden fence that leaned forward as if it had grown tired of standing straight. When I was younger, someone had lived there. I remembered seeing lights in the windows once or twice when I visited my grandfather as a kid. But by the time I moved in as an adult, the place had already been empty for several years. No one ever told me exactly when the neighbor had left, only that he had left suddenly. My grandfather used to mention that house sometimes. Not often, usually just in passing, the way people mention something they don't really want to explain too deeply. He once told me that before the house had been built, there used to be a very small cemetery on that piece of land. Nothing official, just a handful of old graves from families who had lived out there generations earlier. According to him, most of the stones had already been removed long before construction started. But he always said that not everything gets moved just because someone decides to build something new. I never knew if he believed that in a serious way or if he was only repeating something he had heard from someone else years before. He didn't talk about it again after that, and I didn't ask. By the time I moved into his house, the abandoned place across the road had already started to look different from how I remembered it as a child. The windows were darker. The paint had peeled away from most of the siding, and the porch leaned slightly to one side as if it had slowly shifted over the years without anyone noticing. Still, it wasn't the kind of house that made you feel uncomfortable. Not at first. Most evenings after work, I followed the same routine. I drove back from town just after sunset, parked beside the side steps, and listened for a moment before getting out of the truck. The trees always sounded louder after rain, and that part of Pennsylvania had a long stretch of rainy evenings during the colder months. Sometimes the rain would last for hours, sometimes all night. I got used to falling asleep with the sound of it moving across the roof above my bedroom. It made the house feel settled somehow, safer. For the first few weeks after moving in, nothing unusual happened at all. I unpacked slowly, cleaned the kitchen, repaired a loose cabinet door that my grandfather had always meant to fix, but never did. And each night before going to bed, I usually stood for a moment near the front window and looked out across the road without really thinking about why I was doing it. The abandoned house always looked the same. Quiet. Still. Waiting in the dark the way empty houses usually do. Then one evening, near the end of October, after a long day of steady rain that never really stopped even after sunset, something felt slightly different when I stepped inside the house and set my keys down near the kitchen counter. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't movement. It was more like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize someone has just been there a few seconds before you arrived. I didn't think much about it at first. I just assumed I was tired. Later that night, after making a cup of coffee and turning off most of the lights downstairs, I walked toward the front window the same way I usually did before going upstairs. The rain had gotten heavier by then. It moved across the street in long silver lines under the porch light, and for a moment I thought I saw something move near the fence in front of the abandoned house. Not clearly, not long enough to be sure of anything. Just something pale passing between the posts. I stayed there a little longer than usual that night, watching the rain. But nothing moved again. Still, when I finally turned away from the window and headed upstairs to bed, I remember thinking that the house across the road didn't look quite as empty as it usually did. Over the next few days, I tried not to think too much about what I had seen. It was easy enough to dismiss it at first. Rain, shadows, the way light moves when it reflects off wet surfaces, it can make ordinary things look unfamiliar. I told myself that more than once, especially during the daytime when everything felt normal again. The road looked the same. The trees stood still, and the house across the street was exactly as I had always known it, quiet, empty, and worn down by time. But at night, something about it felt different. I didn't notice it all at once. It was gradual, the kind of feeling that builds so slowly you can't really point to when it started. A few nights later, the rain came back again. Not as heavy as before, but steady enough to cover the sound of everything else. I remember pulling into the driveway later than usual that evening. My headlights briefly swept across the abandoned house before I turned the engine off, and that was when I saw it again. Something near the front of the house, standing still. I didn't react right away. At first I thought it might just be part of the porch, one of the wooden posts, maybe, catching the light in a strange way. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that it didn't belong there. It was too narrow, too defined, and for a moment I had the strange impression that it was facing toward my side of the road. I turned the headlights off. Everything went dark except for the faint glow of my porch light behind me. When I looked again, there was nothing there, just the empty porch. I stayed inside that night. I didn't go back out to check. It didn't feel necessary. The next morning, I stepped outside earlier than usual. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the ground damp and quiet. I stood near the edge of the driveway and looked across the road, half expecting to see something out of place. But the house looked exactly the same as always. Nothing moved. No signs of anything. Still, as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something along the edge of the road. Faint marks in the dirt. They weren't clear enough to call footprints. Just slight impressions, spaced unevenly, leading toward the front of the abandoned house. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide if they had been there before, and I just hadn't noticed. Eventually, I let it go. It didn't seem important enough to think about for long, but that feeling, the one I had the night before, it didn't go away. If anything, it became easier to notice. A few nights later, it happened again. I was inside this time, standing near the front window with the lights off in the living room. The rain had returned, lighter than before, tapping softly against the glass. I wasn't really looking for anything, just following the same habit I had built since moving in, looking out, letting my mind slow down before going upstairs. That was when I saw movement again, this time closer to the house. Near one of the front windows, something pale. It moved quickly, too quickly to make out clearly, but I saw enough to know it wasn't just the rain. It passed behind the glass, from one side to the other. Then it was gone. I leaned a little closer to the window, trying to focus on the shape of the house across the road. The darkness inside made it difficult to see anything clearly, especially with the reflection of my own house, faintly visible on the glass. Nothing moved again, but I didn't step away right away. I stayed there longer than usual, watching, waiting. There was a part of me that expected to see it again, that expected something to step back into view, but it didn't. Eventually, I turned away and went upstairs. Sleep didn't come as easily that night, not because I was afraid. At least, I didn't think of it that way. It was more like a quiet awareness that something wasn't as simple as it had been before. Something had changed, even if I couldn't explain what. Over the next week, the pattern continued, not every night, but often enough that I stopped trying to ignore it completely. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of that same pale movement near the house. Other times, it felt like something was there, even when I couldn't see anything at all. The strongest moment came a few nights later. The rain had been falling for hours again, heavier this time, blurring the edges of everything outside. I was already upstairs, standing near the bedroom window, looking out across the road. From that angle, I could see more of the yard in front of the abandoned house, and that was when I saw it clearly for the first time. A figure standing near the front of the house, completely still. The rain moved through it in long lines, making it difficult to focus, but there was no mistaking the shape this time. It was there, facing in my direction. I didn't move, didn't step away. I just stood there, watching from the second floor, trying to understand what I was looking at. The figure didn't move either, not even slightly. For a long moment, the only motion in the entire scene was the rain falling between us. Then, slowly, so slowly I almost thought I imagined it, the shape shifted, not walking, not turning, just drifting slightly to one side, and then it was gone, not fading, not running, just no longer there. I stayed at the window for a long time after that, long enough for the rain to start easing, long enough for the silence to return. But I didn't see anything else that night. Still, when I finally stepped back and turned off the light in my room, one thought stayed with me longer than anything else. It wasn't just that something was there. It was that whatever I had seen was always facing my house. After that night, it became harder to treat what I was seeing as something ordinary. I still tried. During the day, everything felt manageable again. The road looked the same as it always had, and the abandoned house across from mine sat quietly behind its leaning fence, unchanged. But the nights were different now. I found myself paying more attention to small things. The way the porch light flickered sometimes when the rain got heavier. The sound of water dripping from the edge of the roof long after the storm had passed. Even the timing of everything started to feel consistent. The figure, whenever it appeared, was always there at roughly the same hour, just past midnight. I didn't plan to test that idea, but over time, I started noticing it without meaning to. One night, I stayed downstairs longer than usual, sitting in the living room with the lights off, listening to the rain move across the windows. I told myself I was just relaxing, but in the back of my mind, I knew I was waiting. When the clock on the wall passed midnight, I stood up slowly and walked toward the front window. The rain had softened into a steady, quiet rhythm. I looked across the road, and there it was again, standing in the same place, still, facing my house. This time, I didn't feel the same hesitation as before. Not fear exactly, more like a quiet certainty that if I kept watching from inside, nothing would change. So I made a decision I hadn't made before. I stepped outside. The air was cold, and the rain felt sharper than it had from behind the glass. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked slowly down the steps, stopping just at the edge of the driveway. From there, I could see the figure more clearly. It stood near the front of the abandoned house just beyond the fence. Tall, still. The pale outline of it seemed softer up close, less defined, like it didn't fully belong to the space around it. I didn't call out, didn't move any closer. I just stood there for a moment, letting the rain fall between us. Then, without thinking too much about it, I took a few steps forward, crossed the road. Each step felt louder than it should have, even with the rain. When I reached the fence, I stopped again. The figure hadn't moved. It was still facing me. For a brief moment, I had the strange feeling that if I got any closer, something about the situation would change in a way I wouldn't be able to undo. So I stayed where I was, watching, waiting, and then just like before, it happened again. The figure shifted slightly, not a step, not a turn, just a small movement, as if it had been standing in one place for too long and needed to adjust. And then it was gone, completely, as if it had never been there at all. I stood in the rain for a while after that, long enough for the cold to start settling in, long enough to realize that whatever I had been seeing wasn't something I could understand by getting closer to it. I turned and walked back toward my house. That night, I didn't go back to the window. I went upstairs, lay down, and listened to the rain until I eventually fell asleep. The following days were quieter. I still looked across the road out of habit, but I didn't see anything unusual right away. The house remained empty. Still, exactly the way it had always been, but the feeling didn't fully go away. It stayed somewhere in the background, a quiet awareness. A few nights later, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The room was dark, and the rain had returned, tapping steadily against the window beside my bed. I stayed still for a moment, listening. Then I noticed it. A faint glow outside. The porch light. It was on. I knew I hadn't left it on. I always turned it off before going to bed. Slowly, I sat up and looked toward the window. From where I was, I couldn't see the road directly, so I got out of bed and walked closer, carefully. When I reached the window and looked out, my chest tightened slightly. The road was empty. The abandoned house stood in silence, but the light on my porch cast a soft reflection across the wet ground. And in that reflection, I could see something. Faint, distorted by the rain, but unmistakable. A shape, standing somewhere just outside the reach of the light, on my side of the road, closer than before. I didn't open the window, didn't move any closer. I just stood there, watching that reflection for a long time, and slowly, as the rain continued to fall, the shape became harder to see, until eventually it was gone. The next morning, I packed a few things, not everything, just enough to leave. I drove into town that afternoon and stayed with my father for a while. Days passed, then weeks, and after some time, I stopped thinking about the house as often as I used to. Nothing like that ever happened again. No shapes, no movement, no quiet presence standing in the distance. But even now, years later, there's one thing I still remember clearly. On nights when it rains long enough, when the sound settles in the same way it used to back then, I sometimes think about that road, that house across from mine, and the way something stood there, not moving, just watching, as if it had been there long before I arrived and had simply been waiting for me to notice.